Hello, this is Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity project. I'm sitting down to have a conversation with David Friedman, who's been kind enough to take the time to speak to me. Just briefly, for anyone who doesn't know what the Nations of Sanity project is, it's built on the assertion that the only way to create a free society is to establish the non-aggression principle as the law through a universal peace agreement, which would, I argue, would create what we call voluntarism. David Friedman, who many people will know, is a well-known economist, author, and anarcho-capitalist. And I did a video recently responding to David Friedman's conceptualization of anarcho-capitalism as not definitionally libertarian. And I had some counterpoints to make on that. And David's very kindly agreed to have a conversation with me about this. So I just want to say thank you, David, again, for taking the time.
I am always happy to correct the errors of people who disagree with me.
That's very gracious of you. So just to kick off then, I mean, basically just to sum up my kind of objection, basically you were saying that the anarcho-capitalism, I think you described it as prescriptively libertarian in the fact that it would likely create a libertarian society.
I wouldn't make that prescriptively. No? I would say that it will tend to produce libertarian law, but cannot be guaranteed to always do so.
Right. Okay. And basically your assertion is that anarcho-capitalism is not by definition libertarian.
Correct.
So it could exist in a way where, and you gave the example, I believe, of drug laws, that while you think it'd be unlikely that they would exist in an anarcho-capitalism society, they could. You know, they could.
That's right. That anarcho-capitalism I would define in terms of a set of institutions, and then it becomes essentially an economic question to predict what the outcome of those institutions would be. And I would say that anybody else who has an alternative set of institutions has to do the same thing. That what many people do in many political arguments is to specify the outcome rather than the institutions. So somebody says, I want a government which will help the poor at the expense of the rich. And before you argue about whether that's a good thing, you should also argue, is there a reason to expect the institution you're set up to do so? Because you set up political institutions, they make it possible to take money from some people to spend on things for other people. One of the things we observe that such institutions do is to subsidize opera, which is generally a consumption good for the rich, not for the poor, to subsidize higher education, which is a consumption good for the rich, not the poor. They also subsidize some things for poor people, food banks and things. So you want to know first, how can you expect the institutions to behave? And then does that produce whatever outcomes you want? And in my case, the particular outcomes I want that we're discussing are a set of legal rules in which individuals are free to control their own lives. And I argue that you are more likely to get that with the institutions I propose than with any alternatives I know of. So now your turn.
Well, okay. I mean, perhaps we could delve into the definition of anarcho-capitalism then, because I've always defined it as, I mean, I kind of defined it as almost synonymous with voluntarism, only specifying an economic preference. So I've always thought of anarcho-capitalism to simply mean, obviously, the anarchism part of being no state, and then the capitalism part being free market as the way we kind of operate things. Would that be a...
Suppose you have your anarcho-capitalism and you observe that there are some thieves. Is it still anarcho-capitalism? It's not a purely voluntarist society. The rights of people are being violated.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying, but what I would say is it's still an anarcho-capitalist society, but in an anarcho-capitalist society, those crimes are recognized as such. They are recognized as in violation of what anarcho-capitalism is supposed to be. I suppose that would be my...
Let me then go back, because from my standpoint, the critical question is, what's a government? That we observe, it's tempting to try to define a government by what it does, but that doesn't work, because I cannot think of anything that governments do that has never been done by institutions we don't think of as governments. So for example, we're tempted to say waging war is only done by governments, but of course it isn't true. That, as best I can tell, the Norse war bands that ravaged England that Alfred the Great eventually dealt with were not national armies. They were entrepreneurial projects that basically somebody with a good reputation in that society said, look, let's get a bunch of people together, go invade England. They'll pay us off to go away, or yes, we can get some land. So that wasn't being done by a government. And it seems to me that the closest thing I can come to defining a government is the way I originally put it in the first edition of Machinery of Freedom was an agency of legitimized coercion. And then the question is, what do those words mean? Because I'm not using either of them in exactly the standard way. And the way I put it in more detail, I think, in the third edition, is that in any society that individuals have a set of ideas about how other individuals can treat them. And what enforces those ideas, even aside from whatever the legal system is a set of commitment strategies. That essentially I am committed to bear unreasonably large costs to defend against your doing certain things to me. So the story I like to tell is to imagine that we're suburban neighbors in a town with a very badly organized government. And one day you call me over to the fence and you say, I've decided that taking my trash down to the dump is really too much trouble. I'm going to dump it over the fence onto your land instead. And after I say various unfriendly things about this, well, look, think about it. The time and trouble it will take you to take my trash along with your trash to the dump is much less than the time and trouble it will take you to get this incompetent government we have to stop me. All right, you'll have to hire a lawyer, you'll have a bunch of appearances, so it's not worth your doing it. Figure that it'll take $10 a month worth of your time and trouble to deal with the trash. But I've got a deal for you. Pay me $5 a month and I won't do it. All right? Why don't I consider that deal? And the answer is that I've got a commitment strategy. And my commitment strategy is when people try to extort money from me, I'm willing to bear quite large costs to stop them. Not infinite costs. Guy sticks a gun in my ribs and says, give me your wallet, I give him my wallet. But within a substantial range, rather than making the normal calculation, is this worth the cost? I say, no, I'm committed to fight back against this kind of thing. And part of the reason is that if people know I'm committed to fight back against them, I usually won't have to. All right. I like to say this also explains why the UK sent a fleet, and its only aircraft carrier, halfway around the world, most of the way to the South Pole, in order to keep Argentina from seizing a couple of barren islands with a few hundred British citizens on them. That clearly, in cost-benefit terms, the Falkland War made no sense. But the UK, like other states, is committed to the rule, if you try to take our territory, we'll fight, even if it's not very valuable territory. If they didn't do that, you'd lose Gibraltar too. All right. So where those lines are is going to vary in different societies. And what is special about a government is it's the organization against which people drop those commitment strategies. So when the government does the equivalent, when the government says, we've decided that you owe us $500 for the following reason, rather than saying, could I fight them at a cost of less than $100,000? You say, if I can fight them at a cost of less than $500, I'll do it. I'll hire a good tax attorney or something. But beyond that, I just give in and give it to them. So legitimized then doesn't mean I think it's legitimate. That would be one reason to give in. But a different reason is that everyone in my society knows that government is different. They therefore know that the fact that I'm willing to surrender to government doesn't mean I'd be willing to surrender to them. So the incentive to maintain my commitment strategy is weaker than it would otherwise be. And I think that's the closest I can come to defining the difference between a government and other institutions. And I would then say that an anarchist society is a society with no government, with no institution of that sort. And an anarcho-capitalist one is one in which the legal rules are organized on a basis of private property and voluntary trade. But given how complicated legal systems really are, there isn't sort of a bright line rule which says, well, that gives you this legal system and no others. And I'm currently working on one or more books based largely on 15 years of blog posts. It occurred to me that I'd run out of ideas for books, but that I'd been running my blog for 15 years or so, and it had a lot of essays on different things. So I went through all of them, sorted them into about 20 different topics, and I'm currently on the early stages of turning that into a book. And one of the chapters I've written at least a draft of has to do largely with Murray Rothbard. And in particular, part of it is why I don't think he can be trusted, and that has to do with my critique of some stuff he did in History of Economics, which I argue was dishonest. But that's not very important. That's only important personally. And I then say that the interesting thing is our different views of where the legal system of an anarchist society would come from. And as far as I can tell, his view is that the libertarian legal philosophers figure out what the law should be and then everybody does it. And my view is, first, philosophy isn't that neat, and second, philosophy isn't that persuasive. That is to say, you're going to have private firms which are running courts and rights enforcement agencies. They're profit maximizing firms. What they're going to ask is not what do the philosophers say the law should be, but what legal rules will result in my making money. And so one of Rothbard's conclusions, it's interesting because Rothbard comments on the difference between my model and his, but as far as I know, he never saw what from my standpoint is a central difference. He comments that I don't assume that all of the courts will have the same legal rules, that I'm assuming a market for law where you have a whole bunch of rights enforcement agencies. Each of them knows that it is in their interest to have a way of peacefully settling disputes with the others. So each pair of agencies agree on a court. They agree on a court they will use. There's no government to enforce that agreement, but they're repeat players. Since they're repeat players, each of them knows that if he doesn't go along, when he loses the case, the other one won't go, and they're back fighting, and then they'll lose customers to more sensible agencies. So in that system, you've got a competitive market where the rights enforcement agencies are trying to find the private courts that will make it easiest for them to sell their services to their customers. Thus, they will be in effect saying to themselves, if the legal rule is X, how much more is it worth to my customers than if it's Y? And if the agencies disagree about that, if it's worth more to my customers to get it my way than it is to your customer to get it your way, I'll pay you off and we'll agree to do it my way. That's a very simplified version. I discussed this in more detail in Machinery. So in that system, you are going to tend to get the set of legal rules that maximize the welfare of the population, because everybody is sort of implicitly bidding for the rules he wants. Since most libertarians believe that liberty works, that libertarian rules result in people getting more of what they want, more nearly achieving their objectives than alternative rules, the rules that are economically efficient, that maximize sort of the size of the pie, will tend to be libertarian rules, but only tend to be because you might have a society where almost everybody believes that using drugs, or for that matter, being public an atheist, is a horrible thing. And they believe it so strongly that they'd much rather patronize an agency which patronizes a court that rules that way, and you will then get an unlibertarian outcome. But I point out, in that same population, any political system will give you an unlibertarian outcome too. And we've got lots of them that have. So then my challenge to you is not can you describe a system where you get to control what it does? Because you aren't going to get control what it does. I mean, that's my objection to Murray's position, that Murray says explicitly, I've got a quote from him, that if the anarchy doesn't follow the non-aggression principle in its law, then it's not a libertarian anarchy. And I say, well, that's very nice. What are you going to do about it? That he's not going to be running it. He's not proposing himself as dictator of the system. There's no way he'd have the power to do that. So that's what I like to refer to as proof by definition. And I think it's just clearly a logical mistake. So that's basically, so my view is that, now my system might not work. I have discussion in mostly in the third edition of Machinery, some of it in the original, of ways in which the system might break down. And from my standpoint, there are really two major problems. One of them is national defense. One of them is how do you protect against aggressive adjacent states. And I have a number of ideas for ways you might be able to do it, but whether you can do it successfully partly depends on how rich and strong and aggressive they are and how rich and patriotic you are, so to speak. That is, if you have a population where people are willing to make sacrifices to defend, or does each person say, nope, not worth it, I'm not going to do it. So from that standpoint, I think I was really thinking originally in terms of a anarcho-capitalist United States, of the territory I'm in. Well, the US has a big ocean on each side of it. Neither Canada nor Mexico is very likely to make war on an anarcho-capitalist US. And if they do, they're both much weaker than we are. So even if we can only raise a fraction of what it's worth, we can probably beat them. On the other hand, if I was in Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania, I'd be a lot less confident about that because they've got a very big and aggressive neighbor and they're small countries. They might do it, they might manage anyway. That is, in order to defend yourself, you don't have to make it impossible for somebody to conquer you. You only have to make it unprofitable. And that's sort of an important economic point. The science fiction writer Poul Anderson has a short story called Margin of Profit where that's the theme. That the way you stop people from doing things you don't want is to raise the cost of doing it enough so they're losing rather than gaining by doing it, and then not being stupid, they'll stop. It's a neat, the story is called Margin of Profit, if people, for other science fiction readers. One of my unfinished projects, which I may go back to, is a collection of short works of literature that have interesting economics in them. And that's one of my favorite examples, that Poul Anderson story. But anyway, so I guess I got off on various things. The other, so one threat is foreign invasion. And the other threat is cartelization. The other threat is if you have only a small number of rights enforcement agencies, they all get together and they say, look, competing with each other cuts our profits. How about we agree not to take your customers, you agree not to take our customers, each of us now has a monopoly. Maybe we should just merge and reinvent government. Stealing is going to be more profitable than selling our services. And whether that, how likely that is to happen is largely going to depend on how many rights enforcement agencies there are. If you end up with only 2 or 3, then I think the dangers of such a conspiracy become quite large. If you have 100, it seems to me very unlikely, because when a few of them try to do it, the others say, great, we'll take your customers. So anyway, so I've discussed that. So I don't want to claim that my set of institutions will work in all environments, only that it seems to me they will work in some environments, and that if they work, they are going to produce a more attractive outcome than any alternative I can think of.
Yeah, no, that's fair points. And I mean, I take your point with regards to, like, you know, national defense or any kind of defense where, like you say, you don't need to be necessarily more powerful, but just enough that that you can deter them, like it's not worth their while. I mean, a good example over here in England, we obviously have a lot of foxes and we obviously have a lot of cats. And people sometimes worry about their cats with the foxes, but it's very rare for a fox to attack a cat, not because it's not more powerful and couldn't win, but just because a cat possesses enough, you know, attacking potential to do enough damage to the fox, it just wouldn't be worth its while. So I fully take your point on that. Just going back,
lions don't prey on tigers, they prey on zebras.
Exactly. So and even then they prefer the weaker and the young and what have you. So yeah, sure, and I take that point. Just to go back to the definition of government, because I don't know how this would affect the conversation going forward, but I suppose the way I define government is as a ruling entity. So like as an institution or organization or whatever that claims some kind of authority to rule over others.
That claims it? Anybody can claim it. You can claim it.
Sure, yeah, I guess that, but that's how, I suppose that's how, I mean, I suppose what I'm saying is if you have an organization that claims an authority of rule over people, then that is acting as a ruling entity, and that's how I kind of define government. So basically, to separate government from what I would call a voluntary collective, where the coercion's not involved, where everyone is participating on their own volition, then in that instance, I wouldn't call that a government. I would say that's like a voluntary collective, for want of a better description. So I suppose,
but in my, suppose we have a non-libertarian anarcho-capitalism. None of the agencies claim a right to rule people. They just claim that in a certain dispute between persons A and B, they will, of course, defend their customer's position, and the court will rule in his favor, even though, in your and my view, A is doing something he doesn't have a right to do. That's not a, doesn't seem to me that's a claim to rule. It's still an anarchist system. It's just an anarchist system which is producing a less desirable outcome than you'd like it to produce.
well, I mean, I suppose this comes down to our more fundamental disagreement, and I suppose I'm more on Rothbard's side of this, where I suppose where I'm coming from is because anarcho-capitalism, you have to define it to a point. You know, obviously, you know, you can't, for example, have a communist dictatorship and call that anarcho-capitalism. It has to have some defining features. So there are rules to the game. You know, even if you don't establish an official law, there's some kind of rules that define what you're talking about. Now, I do understand that that's not some magic spell that guarantees that it won't ever be altered, but, you know, we can at least say this is what an anarcho, and I've always kind of thought, well, anarcho-capitalism, in my mind, is built on property rights, which itself is built on self-ownership. So for an anarcho-capitalist society to exist where either of those concepts are violated, like drug laws being a good example, for me, that it feels like that's in violation of the underlying principles of anarcho-capitalism, to the point that such a society I would struggle to call anarcho-capitalist based on my conceptualization of what anarcho-capitalism is. So, I mean, what do you think of that objection?
Well, I mean, you can call things anything you like,
Yeah.
but as far as I can tell, to begin with, that there aren't really nearly as sharp, bright lines as you or Rothbard like to imagine as to what does or doesn't count. That after all, when I play my music at 1 in the morning, am I violating the property rights of everybody who can hear me? Well, you know, it's got to be a fuzzy line. Otherwise, you end up saying I can never turn on a light in my house because the photons are trespassing on people 50 miles away. They can prove it by using a high-powered telescope to see whether my light's on. So I don't think it's that clean and tight. And it seems to me much more useful to say if the basic mechanism of the society is private property and trade, it's a capitalist society, and capitalist societies can vary a good deal. I would have said that the U.S. South before the Civil War was on the whole a capitalist society. It unfortunately had human slavery. So it violated rights in a very striking way, but nonetheless, the basic institutions were private property and trade. Unfortunately, that property included ownership of things that shouldn't have been owned, namely people. But still, it seems to me that economically, you've got to think of it as a capitalist system. If you're trying to use economics to analyze how it works, it's very different from a system in which the government controls everything and hands it down.
So would you call it an anarcho-capitalist society?
Well, that one wasn't anarcho-capitalist because it had the government.
Okay, well, imagine you take the government away.
But we've got two different elements.
Okay.
I'm saying the anarcho part is the lack of a government. And you could imagine, I think it would be hard to have a functioning anarcho-communist system because it's very hard to have a functioning society without property. But it's not impossible. People have talked about, suppose that the technological development is so good that we can make practically everything we want at almost no cost. All right, if you think of sort of nanotechnology and a bunch of stuff like that, in that society, maybe you could manage with no private property rights at all. People are perfect, you know, if you're poor, I'll give you, have something, I'll give something to you. I don't care, I got lots of it. And if that society had no private property rights, but had no government, you would call it anarchist, but not anarcho-capitalist. Right? That would be an anarcho-communist society in some sense of communist, one of the senses of communist, common ownership, essentially. And of course, in ordinary capitalist societies, there are commons. There are things which we don't treat as property. So for example, our society has rules for intellectual property. So some forms of intellectual stuff belong to people, but many forms of intellectual stuff don't belong to people. That my standard example is the English language. That you could imagine a legal regime in which the English language was private property. Each word, or at least each word whose originator you could trace, belonged to the person who first used it, and you needed his permission to use that word. And there could be some advantages to that. If you think as an economist, you say, well, look, one of the problems with the English language is that we have no gender neutral pronouns. We have no way of referring to somebody without specifying gender. The closest we can come is say he or she, and that's very clumsy. We can say they, but that offends people who think the logic of the language wants plurals to be used for plurals. Wouldn't it be nice if some entrepreneur hired a linguist to think up a set of gender neutral pronouns that worked, that felt intuitively right, the way Ms. works, for example. And having done that, he then spends a year or so letting anybody who wants to use them for free because he wants to get them into common use. And he then starts charging 10 cents every time anybody uses them. All right, that would be a benefit for making it property. But on the other hand, that would be a very quiet world, because before you said anything at all, you would have to make sure which words you wanted to use belonged to somebody and license rights to do it. All right, so it makes more sense to treat the English language as a commons. All right. And there are going to be other things where that's true. The whole question of property versus commons ends up depending on things like how cheap is it to transact over this kind of property, how costly is it to enforce property rights, and so forth. So there's an old article, which I'm fond of, which is called The Approximate Optimality of Aboriginal Property Rights. And the author points out that if you look at primitive societies, some of them have private property and land and some of them don't. And we're tempted to say the ones that don't are just too primitive to have thought about the idea. But we then discovered that there are some primitive societies that have private property and land part of the year. Why? Because the land is being used in different ways at different times of the year. And if what you're using land for is to grow crops, you really want it to be private property. And if what you're using land for is to hunt large animals across, you really don't want it to be private property, because while you stop at the boundary to get permission, the deer is running off. Probably what you want in that society is something like a property right of hot pursuit on animals that you're pursuing. A right which says, I'm chasing that deer, you don't get to wait till you see me coming by chasing a deer and then you being fresh, cut in ahead of me and grab the deer. Probably, don't know, but that seems like a plausible rule. So where you define what is or isn't property really is not a trivial question. And anyway, so all I'm saying is that therefore you could certainly imagine a considerable range among societies you'll think of as capitalist as to what things are or are not treated as private property, what things are treated as commons. That people often think of the alternative to private property as being government property, but the real big alternative is being nobody's property at all. Something, the air, something that anybody can use. Anyway, so, but I want to push back to a different question, and that is, do you really believe in the NAP, the non-aggression postulate? And I want to give you my friend, the late Bill Bradford's, pretty sure it's his example, and that is you're on the balcony of your 10th floor apartment, you carelessly fall off. By good luck, the flagpole of the 9th floor apartment is underneath and you catch hold of it. And you start going hand over hand onto the balcony of the 9th floor apartment when the owner of that apartment comes out and he says, I do not give you permission to use my flagpole. You let go. Well, if you really believe in the NAP, you got to let go. Not your flagpole.
I think you can still believe in a moral principle while accepting sort of lifeboat situations where you might, I mean, for example, I believe that stealing is wrong, but I can still envisage scenarios, or like the scenario you gave, where I would technically violate the non-aggression principle.
Would you be wrong to do so?
That's a deep and philosophical question. I would say no, but you could certainly make an argument that you violated the non-aggression principle, which is itself a moral principle that I do believe in. So I can understand.
And you don't believe in it. You believe in the mostly non-aggression principle.
Well, No, I mean, I understand what you're saying. I mean, I wouldn't accept that simply because, like, I don't think lifeboat scenarios invalidate a principle. I just think it's I mean, I think technically, if let's put it this way, say I'm violating his property because he's told me he doesn't want me to touch it, and I continue to do so. Perhaps I even jump into his window so I don't fall to my death, and then I'm trespassing. I'm doing all of these things. Now, if he wasn't there, I could perhaps invoke the idea of implicit contact.
Absolutely.
I could say, well, it's reasonable to assume he would let me do this to save my life. But if he's explicitly saying not, then I suppose technically that is a situation where I would violate the non-aggression principle regardless, because my life was in danger. But I don't think a moral principle is invalidated just because somebody would violate it if they're under that level of duress, you know.
And suppose somebody tells you that he believes, perhaps not unreasonably, that unless he has taxation to fund the military, the adjacent state will invade and will kill or enslave him. Now, does that mean that he's in the taxation is no longer a violation of the NAP, or is a legitimate violation?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Well, I want to go back for a moment to the law against atheism. Suppose that the religious people not only are opposed to atheism, they have a reason to be opposed to atheism. And their reason is that they honestly believe that if there are very many visible atheists in the society, God will strike down the country with fire and brimstone and kill them all. Would you now say that from their standpoint, they're being good libertarians, not violating the non-aggression principle in forbidding open atheism, on the ground that the open atheist is coercing them by calling down divine doom upon them?
Well, they're still violating the non-aggression principle when they aggress against others, but you could argue that there's a certain diminishment of criminal intent. I mean, similar to the example you gave of me violating someone's property rights to save my life, even though I've technically violated the non-aggression principle, it is diminished in regards to criminal. You know, there's a difference, for example, between me accidentally breaking your property and intentionally do it. There's not a difference in respect that I've violated it in both cases, but one is a more severe violation because it's, you know, with criminal intent, whereas another one is like accidental, or, you know, like say if I'm in a life or death situation or something like that. So,
but I don't think you can even say that they're violating it at all, because after all, it isn't a violation of the non-aggression principle if you see somebody pointing a loaded gun at you and about to shoot you and you knock it out of his hand.
No, that's defensive.
From the standpoint of my hypothetical, deeply religious believers, you're announcing that God doesn't exist is like pointing a gun at them. Just the causal mechanism is a little bit more complicated. It goes through a God up above who will be angry. So what is or isn't a violation depends on your factual beliefs, and people have different beliefs.
Okay,
I just think that the whole Rothbardian structure is much too tidy, is much too clean, and the result is that it gives you arrogance. That it gives you that. Let me go back. Part of what got me into arguing with Rothbard, even though he unfairly is not alive to be argued with, people I want to argue with frequently die, and I really object to it because how can I argue with him afterwards? Part of what got me into it was that quite a while ago, somebody put up on the web an essay he had written about me, partly about me, in which he said that what was wrong with me was that I didn't hate the state. And he's right. Not that it's wrong, but he's right that I don't hate the state. And what's wrong with Rothbard is that he does hate the state. All's fair in love and war. And he was therefore consistently more interested in whether the argument gave the right conclusion than in how good an argument it was. That would at least be my view. I've discussed that, and you can find it on my blog, and in another year or two, you can find it in a book. In fact, you can probably find it on their web. Well, not yet, but I'll be webbing parts of that book as it goes to get comments. But part of that has to do with the fact that if you really think that everything's perfectly clear, this is or isn't a violation and so forth, then it's very easy to say, and anybody who disagrees is obviously an evil person. And I don't think it's that simple. I think that if I really, going back to my point that anarcho-capitalism might not work, well, if I believe it's not going to work, then it's hard to really get angry at the people who want to set up some kind of a government in order to get a something not as good as what I want, but better than the alternatives. And so that my view is that the state is not the product of evil people trying to do evil things. It's the result of people having different beliefs than I do about what works. Some different moral beliefs, but very largely different consequential beliefs about what institutions create what results.
Yeah, I take that. I mean, just because I mean, to be honest, I agree with you. I mean, I did read your because you sent me a PDF of your disagreement with Rothbard, so I did read that in preparation.
You did, fine.
And I do actually agree with you about the fact that it isn't nice, neat, and tidy. The philosophy doesn't make the principles, and there are fuzzy edges, as you've demonstrated. And we do need to have, for us to apply the principle, we need to have a common understanding of reality. Like the example you gave of somebody being what I would call a delusion, where they think of some higher power and you know, like, so yeah, I take that on board, and I don't disagree with that.
But in a world where we don't always have a common understanding, the best you can probably do is going to involve compromises. Unless you're sure that you and your side have enough power to always get your way, you're going to say, all right, I think your idea that taking a drug will make somebody go crazy and go out in the street with a machete killing people is false, but enough people believe it. I'm not going to be able to get my way, and we're going to see if we can find, you know, something in between complete legalization and whatever you want, which is a sort of, I want to not go back to, people talk about a social contract, and I think they misunderstand the concept. Because what you really have is not a voluntary contract that's morally binding on you. What you really have is a peace treaty. That is to say that in a functioning society, people have different views about what they're entitled to, different views about what's just and what's fair and all the rest of it. And sensible people realize that much as they might like to have everything the way they want to, they really can't expect to, given there are other people with other views and only a minority believing any one of them. And there is therefore some set of compromise rules that people are going along with. And I don't think it's morally binding in the sense in which a contract does, because it's not clear to me that a peace treaty is really morally binding. A peace treaty is the extreme example of a contract under duress, and we usually think of duress as invalidating the moral force of a contract. Nonetheless, there are good reasons to keep peace treaties most of the time. It's usually prudent to. And similarly, it's usually prudent not to directly try to violate the things that are accepted as the rules of your society, even though you can try to persuade people to change them in various ways. Anyway, it's a diversion. It's a digression in a sense, but I think it's relevant to thinking about how human societies work.
Oh, definitely. And as I say, I don't disagree with that murkiness and those fuzzy edges. I do have like a proposed sort of solution for that aspect. But before I go into that, I just want to nail down anarcho-capitalism a little bit more with regards to the definition. And like I said, I do understand that definitions don't magically guarantee anything, but just with regards, because going back to the example you meant of the South when slavery was occurring, obviously it wasn't anarcho-capitalist because there was a government, but if we take everything, if we just remove the government so we can add the anarcho part, my point is even if we remove the government, we don't have the anarcho part, because slavery is in essence like a rule, like the slave masters are in essence like small governments, because they're exerting that same ruling control over their slaves that governments over their, so I mean, so in my mind, it's not anarcho-capitalism for that reason. Again, I know that doesn't magically.
Would it be anarcho-capitalist if it was a society in which the slaves had all sold themselves into slavery, an institution that was fairly common in classical antiquity?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of find it a little bit oxymoronic in regards to the fact that if you sell yourself into slavery, is it really slavery? Because, you know,
now you're a slave, you don't get to reverse it.
Well, yeah, but it's still a contract. Like, you have to have self-ownership. I suppose I define slavery as a denial of your self-ownership. You have to have self-ownership to make a deal with somebody that you
had self-ownership and you then sold it.
But that's, well, yeah, but what I'm saying is I suppose I define slavery as people that are slaves against their will, rather. I suppose if you define slavery as like just, you know, like indentured servitude or something like that, but if it's voluntary, it just seemed to,
I suppose that's a bit of a different.
It was voluntary. It was voluntary when you signed the contract. It doesn't mean that it's still voluntary. You've given somebody else the right to beat you if you don't do what he tells you to.
But it is still voluntary at the base, isn't it? Because you still
started out being voluntary.
Yeah. So I suppose I just wouldn't classify that as slavery in that instance. If you're a sound mind and body and you make an agreement, then you've made an agreement. You know, that I distinguish that from slavery because it's almost like employment, you know?
Yeah, but once that's happened, I mean, I'm an economist, not a moral philosopher. And once that's happened, you have the same structure of relationships. You've got an owner and some slaves, and the owner is bossing the slaves around. And, you know, it's true. It looks a little bit like a mini state, but then so does a corporation. All right. A corporation, it's not slavery because you can drop out at any point. If you're an employee, you can drop out as a stockholder, but you have to sell your stock to somebody else. But no, and one of the points that Ronald Coase made in one of his two famous essays is that Coase essentially was pointing out that if you go back to the calculation controversy, the argument between Mises and people on his side and the various socialist economists on the other side, this would have been between the wars, I think. And what Mises et al. Were arguing was that rational economic calculation in a socialist system is impossible because you don't have the prices to give the information. And what Coase pointed out is if that's really literally true, then no firm could exist. Because a firm, although it's got some external prices for some things, inside the firm, it's coordinating essentially by top-down command. Inside the firm, there are a bunch of resources that are not being traded. They don't have prices. The time of the employees and such. Therefore, what Coase argued is what's really going on is not that it's impossible to coordinate that way. It's just that there are very serious difficulties to doing it. But then there are also some difficulties to market coordination. There are transaction costs on markets. And so his argument is what determines the size of a firm is in effect that the firm expands until on the next margin, the next point where it's saying, should we do this in-house or out or contract it out? The cost, the inefficiencies due to the coordination problem within the firm become larger than the inefficiencies due to having to deal with outside suppliers. And now you switch to the outside suppliers. All right. So but the individual, the way I put it a long time ago was that the capitalist beach is made up of socialist grains of sand, the individual firms within the capitalist society. So I think as an economist, it was still basically a capitalist system, but a capitalist system which unfortunately violated the rights of a bunch of people.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose where I'm coming from, and I'll move on from here, but just to sort of clarify my point, where I'm coming from is, I suppose, although obviously anyone can define anything how they want, obviously if we're going to say, right, we're going to work for anarcho-capitalism, we need to have a consistent and coherent understanding of what that is. And so therefore we need to have some kind of definition, some kind of line where someone can cross, we say, well, that's not anarcho-capitalism anymore.
No, you can also say that I want to work for anarcho-capitalism. One of the reasons I want to work for anarcho-capitalism is that I want a libertarian society. So if I have choices, if I imagine that I was somehow setting up my anarcho-capitalism, I'd say, well, I'd prefer to set it up in ways that I think are more likely to give me a libertarian society. But then the reason I was arguing for anarcho-capitalism in the first place was that I thought it was going to give me more likely to give me a libertarian society than minarchy was. And in the case of minarchy, you could imagine a minarchy where the courts are corrupt. All right, well, that's not as libertarian a society as where the courts are honest, but nonetheless, the only official things that government has the power to do are police, courts, and national defense, which is sort of the old classical liberal definition of minimal functions of the government. It just happens that because the courts are corrupt, lots of individuals manage to steal stuff from other individuals and get away with it in the courts, but that's not an official power. You know, government doesn't say you can steal things. So that would be, I would like to say, if I was setting up a minarchy, I would try to figure out how to make it less likely that that would happen. And similarly, if I'm setting up an anarchy, I'd like to figure out how to make it less likely that the bad outcomes would happen. But in either case, it's still a minarchy or an anarchy. But I want you to defend your version.
Okay, yeah, I will.
I've been
Okay.
defending mine all this time, and you get you want to explain how you're going to solve the problem.
Yes, if I may be so bold. Okay, well, I mean, as I mentioned in my little intro, the Nations of Sanity project is built on the idea of establishing the non-aggression principle as the law through a peace agreement, like a peace treaty, as you say. Now, you made
Peace agreement among whom? Among individuals or governments?
Well, ruling governments, as I would define governments, would be illegal if the non-aggression principle was the law, because they violate the non-aggression principle.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be like a peace treaty in the way that you kind of described when you were talking about peace treaties, which, as you say, is kind of like a threat of force, because it's basically saying these are the terms of peace, and if you violate that, that's why I kind of say terms of peace.
So how are you going to get everybody to agree to this? How are you going to get everybody to agree with this, and what institutions will then enforce that agreement?
Okay, well, just to quickly clarify on the agreement itself as well, because it's actually a three-part agreement, and the reason it's a three-part agreement is to address the very concerns you mentioned about the fuzzy edges. Because it's not enough to just say, let's establish the non-aggression principle of law, because as you rightly pointed out, there aren't precise definitions. Everyone has slightly different interpretations, and we need to accept that there are fuzzy edges where we can't be objective. So basically, the peace agreement is three parts, and it goes like this. You have part one, which is just the basic agreement to establish it as law. Part two is what's called lines in the sand, where we set limits of tolerance over the differing interpretations. And then part three is rightful ownership, about ratifying ownership using, property rights and the non-aggression principle. Now, part two is what's specifically addressing this issue that you mentioned about the fuzzy edges, because what we're saying is okay, we've got fuzzy edges, we've got these gray areas, if you like, but we've also got black and white. If we can kind of have obviously we still need to come together to a reasonable standard of agreement on basic reality. We still, like you mentioned about the person that believes in, the gods and all this sort of stuff. We need to have some kind of, but you need that for anything. But basically, so we have this idea that, okay, this is the analogy I use in an article I wrote actually on it, that I think explains it well. It's like, so you've got the desert, and you've got the grassland, like in the geographical regions. And then as you walk from one, and they're clearly defined, just like non-aggression principle, violations, rape, murder are all clearly, and if you're not hurting others, you're clearly not. So similar to that, you've got that clear definition. But similarly to the non-aggression principle, you've got the fuzzy edge in between. So if you're walking from the grassland to the desert, there would be this area as one slowly becomes the other, as it slowly degrades into a desert. Now, my point is you've got this area in between where people can't definitively say this is where it's now a desert. But there is a limit to that. At one point, you're definitely in the desert. When there's only sand around you, you're definitely in the desert. And likewise, when you're definitely in the grassland. But you've got this area in between that's hard to define. So the purpose of this part two is to draw lines in the sand where we say, okay, on a kind of to a universal standard, this is definitely violating the non-aggression principle. So we're kind of establishing a kind of low resolution version of the non-aggression principle that provides us a universal standard. And then that gray area in between, we're saying, okay, we can't enforce that because this law, what we're doing with the terms of peace, we're saying this is what we can enforce on everybody, not just people that agree to the agreement, but anybody. We're saying these are the terms of peace. If you violate it, we can use force. But in that gray area, we're saying, okay, we can't enforce those standards because we can't say you are definitely black and white violating the non-aggression principle. So if we want to establish rules and standards at a higher resolution, that's when voluntary collectives come into play. That's when you need people to come together voluntarily.
But you haven't answered my question. How are you enforcing this system? Everybody promises and cross my heart and hope to die?
Well, we define our society that way. So it's like, for example, when we
I don't know what those words mean. What are the institutions? What happens to me when I violate these rules? Okay, who makes it happen?
Okay, so like when we abolished slavery, for example, we, as a society, we accepted that slavery was now a crime. Now, someone might still commit slavery in some way, but they'd have to hide it because it's accepted as society and recognized.
Well, except that, in fact, all of the governments in question continue to commit slavery. They just call it the draft.
Well, yeah, but and to be honest, this is my point. This is why abolishing.
We still do. We just call it jury duty.
Well, yeah, exactly. So, but that comes to my point of why I feel this is an important idea, because when we abolished slavery, we didn't do enough. We didn't abolish all violations of self-ownership. We just took one.
But we abolished slavery within a governmental system where there were police, there were government courts, which could arrest people for doing things. So if you have such a system, what I want to know is what makes it in the interest of the people who are making the laws and who are enforcing the laws to do what you want. You can talk about the rules you want them to agree to, but now we observe in our present system that legislators try to figure out what will get them elected. And what will get them elected is not necessarily behaving in the way you want them to behave. What will get them campaign donations and so forth. So you haven't yet told me how you are setting up institutions that will actually behave in the way you want them to behave. You've just told me what you want the rules to be, but not why those are going to be the rules.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, I suppose I'm saying that if I'm jumping ahead of myself, if the rules are this, then the institutions that I suppose I'm saying that any institutions that we create, there needs to be some rules that they play to. And the only rules that we can demand of others morally are the non-aggression principle, because it's by definition defense to it. Like, you know, enforcing the non-aggression principle is by definition of an act of defense. So it's really just taking the basic principle, the basic concept of self-ownership, and basically saying, look, as a matter of fact, if you violate the non-aggression principle, you're committing an aggression. And as a matter of fact, if anybody uses force to prevent that, then that's an act of defense.
So are you claiming that you're going to be so persuasive in your philosophy that nobody will choose to violate it because they've all been persuaded it's a bad thing to do? If not, what are the mechanisms that are enforcing it?
Well, I hope I can be so persuasive in my philosophy, but I mean, the mechanisms is basically we need to define our society under that law. So it's basically
I don't know what those words mean. What does define our society?
Well, I mean, I use the
you have a government.
Well, I mean, again, this comes to how I define a government, because I'm saying that if you have an organization that is only making law that is defensive, like only saying we're going to use.
Does it have a monopoly?
No.
If can other people enforce rights?
Yes.
Who decides if there's a disagreement between what your agency and my agency? What happens?
Well, this is why we need that universal low resolution, because
but that's a statement of how you want them to behave, not of what makes them behave that way. You keep specifying your outcome, not the mechanisms to give the outcome. Look, I can do better than that. I want a society where everybody is free and nobody has to work because the goods and services come down out of heaven, given, like manna for the Israelites. I can define all sorts of outcomes. I don't have to have any way of getting it.
Okay, I mean, all right, okay, I see what you're saying. Well, I mean, if I had the perfect answer to how I'm actually going to make it happen, it would be happening right now. So I obviously don't have all the answers. No, that doesn't
follow, because I've got the perfect answer and it's not happening right now.
Well, maybe that alludes to the fact that it's not the perfect answer.
There's two stages to this. Okay. I'm not asking you how you will get your institution set up, because I don't have a good mechanism for getting mine set up, although I try to persuade people. I'm asking you, once your institutions are set up, how are they going to run? What are the institutions, and why will it be in the interest of the individuals in that system to behave in the way that you want them to? And you haven't answered that question.
Right. Sorry, I was delving into the principle rather than the expediency. Sorry, I understand what you're saying. Okay, well, I mean, I suppose the way I'm kind of pitching it to people is basically saying that, like, you have the left and the right wing who are obviously at each other's throats and despise each other, and my point is they actually have kind of good reason to despise and fear each other, because whichever one of them has power over the ruling government, they're going to oppress the other side in some kind of way. I mean, they'll probably oppress the people on their own side as well, because it's not so, but that's the reason why people have a reason to fear. Now, in what I would call a truly free society, where the non-aggression principle is established as the law and all institutions have to operate within that, then what you would have is a situation where, say, you have people on the left wing who want to have like collectives and socialism and stuff like that, and you have people on the right wing who don't want anything to do with that. My point is if you had this as the the law that all have to obey, then neither can force the other into doing it. So what that would do is that would create a better foundation for negotiating, potentially working together. I'm going to give you one example, a quick example. We had the Brexit thing over here in England, right? Like the EU versus the UK government. Now, what I'm saying is, I mean, all right, they're governments. So in a free society, they wouldn't be ruling governments, but let's say they were vying for regulation over the market. Like we would regulate it through the EU or regulate it through the UK government. Because even in a free society, you can have regulated markets. They wouldn't be mandatory. People could choose to trade unregulated or regulated.
I'm not sure I know what does that mean. One of the critical issues is, are there tariffs are there taxes on bringing goods between the UK and France?
Well, if it was
Well,
through
either there are or there aren't. If you're somebody in the UK who says those damn Frenchmen, they're undercutting my wine because they've got better weather for growing wine than I do, I want to have a tax to protect me. Well,
okay.
he doesn't want to only have a tax that for wine that he buys. He wants a tax for wine that you buy because he wants you to buy his wine instead.
Well,
So I don't see how you can give both sides what they want.
Well, you can, because what you can do is you can say, as a matter of law, no one would have the right to tax anybody. But in a regulated system that people are voluntarily part of, then you could apply whatever you want. So what you can say is, we have
But the people who are buying wine are not interested in being part of the system with the taxes on importing wine.
That's fine.
And those are the people who the producers of wine care about. So you're not really giving them what they want.
How do you mean? Sorry.
The wine, the people who are producing, who want to produce wine in England, which is a difficult thing to do, but not impossible. People who are producing wine in England want a rule saying anybody who buys wine, if he buys it from France, he's got to pay an extra 10%, because that's what will give them customers for their more expensive English wine.
Yeah, what I'm saying is as a matter of law, they can't do that. But as a rule within the regulated system that they're a part of, it could be applied. But it would only apply to people that are part of that regulated system. And yeah, you're quite right. People can say, okay, well, I don't want to be part of that regulated system.
Yeah,
that would be their choice in a free society.
So therefore, they're not getting what the wine makers are not getting what they want.
Well, no, but not everyone's going to get what they want in a free society. I'm not too concerned about that.
Yeah.
My only concern is whether anyone's rights are violated. And I feel like the only way we're going to build a society that can properly guard against that never guarantees it will never happen. You know, like we can have laws against rape. That's not going to mean that no one will ever get raped, but it means that as a society, we recognize it as a crime. Now, my point is the point of making the non-aggression principle the law is saying that as a society, we need to recognize all violations of the non-aggression principle as crimes as a society, just like when we abolished slavery. I know it was done through government processes, but the other thing that was done was we recognized it as a society as a crime. So anyone doing it would have to do it in secret, just like rapists have to rape in secret, and and all these sort of things. So it's about setting that kind of standard so that everything that you do, like with your courts, like the private courts that you might have in an anarcho-capitalist society, if there's no limit, like literally no limit, they can stretch the fuzzy edges and go straight into the black and white. To use my analogy, they can stand in the middle of the desert and call grasslands. If we lose all of that,
they don't want any customers if they do that, because the courts are relying on selling their services to pairs of rights enforcement agencies. The rights enforcement agencies are relying on selling their services to customers. And if the courts insist that 2 and 2 equals 5 in one form or another, that will be a unsatisfactory arrangement from the standpoint of the customers. The gain to me of being able to violate your rights is almost always less than the loss to you of having your rights violated. So it's unlikely that it will be able to persuade the courts to rule that way. It's not the courts in my system don't have any power except to the extent that people choose to use them.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is if coercion.
I'm not sure this is getting very, very far.
Sorry.
And I'm just thinking that I've made a bunch of arguments that are new to you, and you're making arguments that are not new to me, and you may need some time to think through what the best rebuttal is of the line of some arguments that I've been sketching.
For sure. I mean, I would love to speak to you again if that's something you'd be open to. So I could think about a lot of, because you are bringing things to me that obviously I haven't had time to think about.
It just seems to me that all of your stuff amounts to saying, if we got the outcome I want, it would be good. Fine. That's not very interesting. Be even better if everybody had an income of $100,000 a year without working for it, and prices were still the same, and so there are all sorts of desirable outcomes one can imagine. But I don't understand what sort of a society agreement means, how in principle one would get such a thing. I can tell you how in principle we can do what I want to do. I just don't think I can do it, namely by having government gradually reduce the range of things it does, and have more and more of government's functions be taken over by private institutions, which already happens a good deal. We have private schools as well as government schools. We've got the American Arbitration Association as well as the courts. We've got gated communities where police protection is being, in effect, provided on the market and so forth. So I can describe what it would look like but I can't understand unless your story is, my story is that everybody is persuaded that it is wicked to initiate coercion. And then I suppose that would be an answer. That just seems to me extraordinarily unlikely you'll manage to.
Well, I suppose I'm saying we need universal rules to the game that everyone, no matter how different they are in other aspects, whether that's socialist or capitalist or whatever. But just to touch on your point quickly, I will wrap this up. So, you know, because I understand what you're saying, but I just want to make a couple of quick points if I can, just before we do finish. Because like when you said about, like when I use the example, oh, if someone's allowed to just use coercion and whatever, and you said, oh, well, they'll lose customers. But the problem is in a coercive system, the losing customers thing isn't so much of an issue, because if you can use coercion, you know, this is the problem with government. This is why we don't get value for money from government programs, because they don't need to provide value for money because they're stealing the money from us anyway, you know. So my point is there needs to be some line drawn somewhere to say that, okay, you're no longer operating an anarcho, you know, you're violating property right. You know, what I'm saying is if we don't define it to a certain degree, even if it's quite low resolution, like, you know, like this whole idea of making the non-aggression principle of the law in a low resolution way, it's just saying we need to have some kind of, okay, this is, now you're stepping into the realms of committing crimes. Now, you know, like with the private courts, we can have these gray areas where there can be, you know, agreement to disagree, but we need to have a limit to that, because if we don't have a limit to that, then the principle itself vanishes. And if the principle vanishes, then, like, you know, anarcho-capitalism is itself built on property rights. So it's like property rights surely need to be respected to a certain extent for an anarcho-capitalist society to function. And I feel like if
we would say that property rights have to be respected to a certain extent for us to call it capitalist.
Yeah.
And there must be no government for us to call it anarchist. And those are two different propositions. And it seems to me that the degree of property rights respect necessary to make it, the economic description of it as capitalist, is a whole lot less than the degree of property rights respect that you would need to call it libertarian. And my example of a slave society, which it seems to me is not libertarian, but is still capitalist, can still be capitalist, would seem to me to demonstrate that. And then I want to say, given that it has enough property rights respect so that we can call it capitalist, here's why I expect it to generate rules that are libertarian.
But I would say that the slave society wouldn't be anarcho-capitalist because the slave owners are acting like small government, because that's how you define. I mean, I suppose we could quibble over definitions.
Except that governments claim that everybody in a given territory they have the right to rule over, and the slave owner only claims that his slaves he has the right to rule over. He claims the right to rule over them when they're off the plantation, and he doesn't claim that anybody who comes onto the plantation is now his slave.
All right, so
really
you would say that
like the government.
So you would say that
like something else.
So you would say that the geographical territory would be part of the definition of government.
That's an interesting question. I guess I would have said
how you separate them.
Yeah, I wouldn't have to be geographical. It usually is, but I would have said again that the fact that that in that society there is some set of rules that people recognize as what you're allowed to do to each other, and those rules are enforced by the kind of commitment strategy I described, and that the government is the agency against which some sizable set of people, usually geographically homogeneous, but you could imagine having two things in the same territory, say, have dropped that commitment strategy. And it seems to me that's as close as I can come to give a useful definition.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I suppose from my point of view, the reason why I prefer voluntarism as a term is because it's more explicitly libertarian than anarcho-capitalism, where even the anarchist bit just says no government. It doesn't say we have to be libertarian, you know, although I always feel like it's implied, because I suppose the way I define anarchism is no government, or no rulers, perhaps, as a more general term. And then the way I define voluntarism is almost the same, no government, no rulers, but because people have self-ownership. And I suppose that's why I'm working more towards a voluntarist society than an anarchist one, because I feel like we need to build on that principle. So, I mean, I am more on Rothbard's side of it, but yeah, would you be up for another conversation if I sort of went away and thought about this? Would that be something you're open to?
Think about it for a reasonable length of time.
Sure, yeah. Okay, well, in that case then, unless you've got anything else you want to add, I'll wrap it up.
I've made my points, I think.
Okay, that's great. Okay, well, thank you very much. I genuinely really appreciate you
Thank
taking
you.
the time.
Pleasant conversation.
It
Bye-bye.
was. It was. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.